The gate creaked as it swung open, a sound so familiar it brought everything back at once. David hadn't been here in nearly 10 years. The sanctuary looked different now, newer fencing, expanded enclosures, a painted sign near the entrance that hadn't existed before. But the smell was the same, dust and dry grass and something wild beneath it all. He stood just inside the threshold, hands loose at his sides, breathing it in. He told himself he'd come back to visit old friends, to see how the place had grown. But that wasn't the whole truth. There was one reason he'd driven 6 hours through the heat, one name he hadn't been able to shake from his mind no matter how much time had passed. He didn't know if it was foolish to hope. Lions didn't remember the way dogs did. Everyone said so. But hope was a stubborn thing. The lead keeper, a woman named Angela, met him near the main office. She smiled when she saw him, though her eyes held something careful. She asked how he'd been. He said fine. She asked if he wanted to walk the grounds. He said yes. They moved slowly along the pathways between enclosures, past zebras flicking their tails in the shade, past a pair of cheetahs stretched long and golden in the afternoon light. David listened as Angela explained the new programs, the education outreach, the breeding efforts. But his mind was elsewhere. Then she stopped, just before the turn that led to the large predator section. She looked at him with that same carefulness, and he understood she knew why he'd really come. "He's still here," she said quietly. David's chest tightened. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "I should tell you," Angela continued, her voice soft. "He's not the cub you knew. He's full grown now, over 400 pounds. We don't go in with him anymore, not since he turned 3. David nodded. He'd expected that. He knew what lions became. "Does he?" He stopped himself. The question felt absurd, but Angela seemed to understand. "I don't know," she said, "but you can see him if you want." They walked together around the bend. The enclosure stretched wide, bordered by tall mesh fencing and reinforced posts. Inside, the land rolled gently, dotted with acacia-like structures for shade and a few large stone formations where the cats could rest. It was quiet, empty-looking at first. Then Angela pointed toward the far end, near a cluster of boulders. David saw him. The lion was lying in the shade, his body massive and still, his mane dark amber shot through with gold. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the shape of him. The broad skull, the scars along his shoulder faint now, but visible if you knew where to look. David's breath caught. He had been so small once, small enough to cradle, small enough to feed with a bottle in the middle of the night when no one else would stay. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind stirred the dry grass inside the enclosure. Somewhere behind them, a bird called out, sharp and brief. Then the lion's head lifted, slowly, deliberately, his golden eyes fixed on the fence line, on the 2 figures standing just beyond it. David felt his pulse quicken. He took a step closer, then stopped, uncertain. Angela stayed a few feet back, watching. The lion didn't rise, not yet, but his gaze didn't waver either. It was direct, unblinking, the kind of stare that weighed everything. David's throat felt tight. He didn't know what he'd expected. Recognition seemed impossible, and yet something in the way the lion looked at him, steady, focused, almost curious, made his hands tremble. "Hey," he whispered. The word came out rough, barely audible. The lion's ears flicked forward. Angela said nothing. She only stood there, arms crossed loosely, her expression unreadable. David could feel her presence beside him, grounding him, but all his attention was on the animal across the enclosure. On the way, his tail twitched once against the dirt, on the slow rise and fall of his ribs, on the stillness that felt less like indifference and more like consideration. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the enclosure. The lion remained where he was, head up, eyes locked on the man at the fence, and David stood watching him, heart hammering in his chest, wondering if memory could cross a gap this wide, wondering if somewhere inside that powerful, wild body there was still a trace of the cub who once fell asleep in his arms. He didn't move. He only waited. And the lion, for reasons no one could name, did not look away. Angela's voice came soft but firm. "David, don't get any closer." He hadn't realized he'd moved. His hand was on the fence now, fingers curled lightly around the metal mesh. He could feel the warmth of the wire beneath his palm, heated by hours in the sun. The lion was still watching him, still motionless except for the slow, deliberate movements of his breathing. Angela stepped forward, not blocking him, but close enough that her presence registered as a gentle boundary. "He's not aggressive," she said, "but he's unpredictable, especially with strangers." David didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the lion, on the shape of him against the late afternoon light. "He's not looking at me like I'm a stranger." Angela hesitated. He could feel her weighing her words. "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but it's been a long time." It had. 10 years. Long enough for a cub to become something else entirely. Long enough for memory to fade, to blur into instinct and survival, and the countless days that followed. David knew that. He did, but standing here now, with those golden eyes fixed on him, unwavering and deep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, something unspoken, something that didn't need words to be real. He let his hand fall from the fence, took a slow breath. The air smelled like dust and dry earth and the faint musk of the big cats. He thought of the night he'd found the cub. Not here, miles away, in a different place, a different life. The cub had been alone, too young to survive on his own, his mother gone for reasons no one ever confirmed. Poachers, maybe. Disease. The bush didn't always offer answers. David had been working with a rescue team then, contracted to help with wildlife relocation. He wasn't supposed to keep the cub, wasn't supposed to get attached, but the nights had been cold, and the cub had been so small, and when David wrapped him in a blanket and held him close, the tiny body had stopped shivering. He remembered the scars even then, faint marks along the shoulder and flank, signs of some early struggle. He remembered the way the cub's eyes had watched him in the dim light of the tent, wide and uncertain but not afraid. And he remembered the weight of that small head resting in his hand, the warmth of breath against his palm, the soft rumble that wasn't quite a purr but close. "What did you call him?" Angela asked. David blinked. The memory dissolved. He looked at her, then back at the lion. "Tau," he said. His voice was rough. "It means lion in Setswana." Angela nodded slowly. "We kept the name. It's in his file." Something tightened in David's chest. He hadn't known that, hadn't thought to ask. He'd left the sanctuary years ago, taken a job elsewhere, told himself it was better not to follow what happened after. Cubs grew up. They forgot. That was the way of things. But hearing the name now, knowing it had stayed with him, felt like a door opening to something he thought he'd closed. The lion shifted, just slightly. His front paws stretched forward, claws extending briefly before retracting into the dirt. His tail flicked once, twice. Then he lowered his head, resting it on his paws, but his eyes remained open, still watching. David's hands were trembling. He pressed them against his sides. Angela said something about protocol, about safety regulations, about how even the most familiar animals could become dangerous in an instant. He heard her, but the words felt distant. All he could focus on was the lion, on the scars he recognized even after all this time, on the way the afternoon light caught the edges of his mane, on the stillness between them that felt less like separation and more like waiting. He took a breath. Then, without thinking, he spoke. "Tau." The name came out barely louder than a whisper. He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned it, but it left his lips like something long held and finally released. The lion's ears swiveled forward. For a moment, nothing else moved. The wind died. The distant sounds of the sanctuary faded. Even Angela went quiet. David stood there, hands still pressed to his side, heart pounding in his chest, watching as the massive animal across the enclosure lifted his head just slightly. Just enough, and in that small, deliberate movement, David felt something shift. Not certainty, not proof, but possibility. The fragile, trembling possibility that some part of the past had not been lost. That some connections, no matter how unlikely, could survive the years. He didn't move closer. He only stood there, saying nothing more, letting the name settle in the space between them like a question waiting for an answer. The lion's body shifted. It was subtle at first, a redistribution of weight, a tensing of muscle beneath golden fur. Then his shoulders rolled forward, and he rose, slowly, deliberately. Each movement measured, controlled, as if he were testing the air itself for something invisible. David's breath caught in his throat. He didn't step back, didn't move at all. Every instinct told him to hold still, to let this moment unfold without interference. Angela's hand touched his arm, light but insistent. "David, I know," he said quietly. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. The lion stood fully now, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. He was enormous, far larger than David had imagined, even knowing what adult males became. His mane was thick and dark, framing a face that held both power and something else, something David couldn't quite name. The scars along his shoulder were clearer now, pale lines against tawny fur, marks of a life David had only been part of for a brief window. The lion's tail swayed once, low and slow, and his gaze never wavered from the man at the fence. Then he took a step forward. David's heart slammed against his ribs. The distance between them wasn't far, maybe 30 feet, but it felt vast and fragile at the same time. Angela's grip on his arm tightened. She said something about backup, about calling another keeper, but her voice seemed to come from far away. All David could hear was the sound of his own breathing, shallow and uneven, and the faint rustle of movement as the lion took another step, then another. He moved with a kind of precision that felt almost deliberate, not hunting, not stalking, but purposeful. His body remained low, shoulders forward, eyes locked on David's. There was tension in every line of him, not aggression, but focus. The kind of focus that came from making a choice and committing to it fully. David's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to steady himself. He thought about stepping back, about giving the lion space, but something held him there. Something in the way Tao moved, in the way his ears stayed forward instead of pinned, in the way his approach felt less like a threat and more like a question. The lion stopped. 10 feet from the fence now, close enough that David could see the individual whiskers along his muzzle, the faint ring of darker gold around his eyes, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, close enough to hear the low, rumbling exhale that wasn't quite a growl. Tao's head lowered slightly, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, watching. David didn't know what to do. Protocol said to back away. Common sense said the same. But memory, stubborn, relentless memory, whispered something different. He thought of the nights in the tent, the small body curled against his chest, the way the cub had nuzzled into his hand when he was frightened or cold. He thought of the trust that had existed then, fragile and new, built in the quiet hours when no one else was watching. "Tao," he said again, softer this time, almost a breath. The lion's ears flicked, his tail stilled, and then, in a movement so slow it felt like time itself had stretched, he took another step forward. Angela pulled gently at David's arm. "We need to move back." But David couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his entire body caught between fear and something deeper. The lion was close now, so close that David could see the flecks of amber in his eyes, could hear the faint scrape of claws against dirt, could feel the weight of his presence like a living thing. Tao's head lowered further, bringing his face level with the fence line. His nostrils flared, taking in scent. His gaze remained fixed, unblinking, searching. David's chest ached. He didn't know what he was hoping for, didn't know if hope even made sense here. Lions didn't remember people the way stories claimed. They remembered food sources, territories, threats. But faces, voices, the hands that once held them when they were small and helpless, that seemed like wishful thinking, like the kind of thing people wanted to believe because it made the world feel less harsh. But then Tao did something unexpected. He lowered himself, not all the way to the ground, but enough that his body sank, his front legs bending, his posture shifting from tension to something quieter. His tail curled around his haunches, his breathing slowed, and his eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes, softened, just slightly, just enough. David felt something break open inside him. He didn't know if it was relief or grief or some tangled combination of both. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to clear it, but the tightness in his throat wouldn't ease. Behind him, Angela had gone silent. The whole sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Tao remained where he was, crouched low, head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. The fence stood between them, solid and unyielding, but in that moment it felt almost irrelevant. The distance that mattered wasn't physical. It was the years, the silence, the question of whether anything from that brief, shared past had survived. David lifted his hand, slowly, carefully. He didn't reach through the fence. Angela would never allow it. And he knew better, but he placed his palm flat against the mesh, fingers spread. A gesture, an offering, a way of saying what words couldn't. The lion's gaze dropped to the hand, his nostrils flared again, and for one breathless, impossible moment, he leaned forward, just an inch, just enough that the space between them became something other than emptiness. David's voice came out broken. "I remember you." The words hung in the air, fragile and certain, and the lion, massive and wild and impossibly present, did not move away. What happened next unfolded so quietly that later, when Angela tried to describe it to the others, she would struggle to find the right words. There was no dramatic charge, no sudden movement, only a kind of inevitability, as if the moment had been waiting all along for them to arrive at it. Tao shifted his weight forward, his massive head lowered further, pressing toward the fence with a deliberateness that made David's breath stop altogether. The lion's eyes half closed, not in fear or submission, but in something that looked almost like concentration. His nostrils flared wide, pulling in air, pulling in scent, and then, with a movement so careful it seemed to defy everything David understood about wild animals, Tao pressed the broad plane of his forehead against the mesh. The fence bowed slightly under the weight. Not much, just enough to show the pressure, the intention. Tao's ears were forward, his body still lowered in that quiet crouch, and his breathing had steadied into something deep and rhythmic. David could see the individual hairs of his mane shifting in the faint breeze, could see the way his whiskers bent against the wire, could see, in the lines of his face, traces of the cub he'd once known, the shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the scars that had been there from the beginning. David's hand was still pressed to the fence. He hadn't moved it, hadn't dared. But now, with Tao so close, with only the mesh between them, he felt something shift inside himself, a loosening, a permission he hadn't known he needed. Slowly, barely breathing, he let his fingers shift upward. Not through the fence, he wouldn't risk that, but along it, until his palm rested directly opposite the place where Tao's head pressed forward. The heat came through first, the warmth of living bone and muscle and fur radiating through metal. David's hand trembled. He spread his fingers wider, trying to match the curve of Tao's skull, and for a moment he could almost feel the weight of it, the solidity, the impossible realness of this creature who had once fit in the crook of his arm. Angela had stepped back. He was vaguely aware of her presence a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her, her face caught between concern and something that looked almost like wonder. She didn't speak, didn't intervene. She only watched, as if she understood that whatever was happening here existed outside the boundaries of procedure or protocol. Tao exhaled, a long, low breath that David felt more than heard. The lion's eyes opened fully again, and they were so close now, maybe 6 inches apart, separated only by wire and air, that David could see his own reflection in them. Small, fragile, human. And yet Tao did not pull away, did not snarl or flatten his ears or show any of the signs that would indicate distress or aggression. He simply stayed, pressed forward, present. David's throat burned. He tried to swallow, but the tightness wouldn't ease. 10 years since he'd last touched this animal. 10 years since he'd fed him, cleaned his wounds, sat with him through the long nights when the cub had cried for a mother who would never return. David had told himself it didn't matter, that his role had been temporary, that the cub would grow and forget and become something entirely separate from those early months. He'd believed that, or tried to, but now, standing here with Tao's massive head pressed against the fence, with the warmth of him soaking through the mesh, David realized he'd been wrong. Memory wasn't always conscious, wasn't always something you could name or explain. Sometimes it lived in the body, in the way a scent triggered recognition, in the way a voice, half forgotten, could still mean safety, in the way presence itself could bridge gaps that time and distance had tried to make permanent. "You remember," David whispered. It wasn't a question, not anymore. Tao's ears flicked, his head shifted slightly, angling so that the pressure changed, so that more of his weight leaned into the fence. And then he did something that nearly broke David apart. He made a sound, low and rumbling, rising from somewhere deep in his chest. Not a growl, not quite a purr, something in between. A vocalization that adult lions rarely made, except in specific contexts: greeting, reassurance, social bonding. The kind of sound that spoke of recognition. David's vision blurred. He blinked hard. But the tears came anyway, hot and sudden. He didn't try to stop them, didn't move his hand. He only stood there, palm pressed to the fence, feeling the vibration of Tao's vocalization travel through metal and air and skin, feeling the impossible weight of this moment settle into his bones. Angela's voice came soft from behind him. "I've never seen him do that." David couldn't respond. His throat was too tight. He focused on breathing, on staying present, on not letting the enormity of this overwhelm him so completely that he forgot to witness it, because this was what he'd come for, even if he hadn't admitted it to himself. This was the question that had haunted him for a decade, whether the bond they'd shared had meant anything beyond survival, whether love, if that word even applied to the connection between a man and a wild animal, could outlast the forgetting. Tao's breathing deepened. His body relaxed further, the tension in his shoulders easing, his tail coming to rest fully on the ground. He didn't pull away, didn't lose interest. He simply stayed there, head pressed forward, eyes half-lidded, his presence solid and undeniable. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt strange, elastic, as if the usual rules didn't apply here. David's hand ached from holding the position, but he didn't move it. He thought about all the things he wanted to say, about the nights he'd worried whether Tao would make it, about the day he'd had to leave when the sanctuary had taken over the cub's care and David's contract had ended, about the years of wondering if he'd done enough, been enough, mattered enough to leave any trace at all. But words felt insufficient, clumsy. What was happening here existed in a language older than speech. Slowly, carefully, Tao began to pull back. Not suddenly, not in a way that felt like rejection, just a gradual easing of pressure, a shift in weight, as if he'd communicated what he needed to and could now return to himself. His head lifted, his eyes met David's one last time, clear and calm and impossibly knowing. Then he turned, his massive body moving with the fluid grace of his kind, and walked back toward the far end of the enclosure. David's hand dropped. He felt hollowed out, emptied of everything except this quiet, overwhelming gratitude. Angela stepped beside him, and he could feel her eyes on his face, but she didn't ask if he was all right. She seemed to understand that all right was the wrong question. They stood together in silence, watching as Tao settled back into the shade near the boulders, and David knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that something had been given back to him, something he thought he'd lost. David knew it was time to leave before Angela said anything. The light had shifted, stretching long across the enclosure, turning everything golden and soft. The heat of the day was fading into something gentler. He could feel the ache in his legs from standing so long, the exhaustion settling into his shoulders like weight he'd been carrying without realizing it. But more than that, he could feel the completeness of the moment. It had given him what he came for. Asking for more felt greedy. He took a step back from the fence, then another. His hand fell to his side, fingers still tingling from the pressure of holding them against the mesh. Angela moved with him, quiet and respectful, her presence a steady comfort. They walked slowly back along the pathway, past the other enclosures, past the painted signs and the newer structures. David's mind felt strangely quiet, not empty, just still, as if something that had been restless inside him for years had finally settled. Behind them, Tao remained in the shade near the boulders. David glanced back once, unable to help himself, and saw the lion lying down now, his body stretched long, his head resting on his paws. He looked peaceful, untroubled, as if the encounter had been as natural to him as breathing. David wondered if Tao would remember this moment tomorrow, next week, or if it would fade into the rhythm of his days, unremarkable and unnoticed. He supposed it didn't matter. What mattered was that it had happened at all. Angela walked him to the main gate. She offered coffee, a chance to sit and talk, but David declined gently. He wasn't ready for words yet, wasn't ready to try to explain what had passed between him and the lion, or what it meant, or whether it even needed to mean anything beyond itself. Some experiences lived better in silence. She seemed to understand. She clasped his hand briefly, warmly, and told him he was welcome back any time. He thanked her, meant it, but he didn't know if he would return. Part of him felt that coming back might dilute what had happened here, might turn it into something he tried to recreate instead of something he simply held. He drove for an hour before he stopped, pulled off onto a dusty overlook where the land stretched wide and empty beneath a sky going pink and orange with sunset. He turned off the engine and sat in the silence, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring out at nothing in particular. His chest still felt tight, his eyes still burned, but there was something else now too, a kind of peace he hadn't expected. A sense that he'd been forgiven for something he didn't know he needed forgiveness for leaving, for moving on, for not being there as Tao grew from a cub into the magnificent animal he'd become. But maybe forgiveness wasn't the right word. Maybe what had happened at the fence wasn't about absolving the past. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just proof that connection, real connection, didn't require continuous presence. That the imprint left by care and safety and love, even the limited love a human could offer a wild creature, could remain long after the hands that gave it were gone. David thought about the nights he'd spent with the cub, the fear he'd felt that Tao wouldn't make it, the relief when he started gaining weight, started playing, started showing the fierce, stubborn vitality that all young lions possessed. He thought about the morning he'd handed Tao over to the sanctuary team, how small the cub had looked in the transport crate, how David had wanted to reach in one last time but hadn't, knowing it would only make the separation harder. He'd told himself then that it was better this way, that clean breaks were kindest, that Tao would forget him within days. He'd been wrong about that, or maybe he hadn't. Maybe Tao had forgotten, in the way that forgetting usually worked, the conscious memory fading, the details blurring. But the body remembered, the senses remembered. The part of him that had once been small and frightened and dependent had recognized the part of David that had offered safety. And that recognition, brief and wordless as it was, had been enough. The sun slipped lower. The sky deepened into shades of amber and rose. David watched it without thinking, letting the beauty of it wash over him. Somewhere back at the sanctuary, Tao was likely settling in for the night, finding his preferred sleeping spot, stretching out beneath the stars, living the life he was meant to live, wild in all the ways that mattered, even within the boundaries of the enclosure. David started the engine. He didn't know what he'd tell people when they asked where he'd been, didn't know if he'd even try to describe it. Some things resisted description, resisted the flattening that happened when you tried to turn lived experience into story. But he knew he'd carry this with him, the weight of Tao's head against the fence, the sound of that low, rumbling vocalization, the look in those golden eyes that had held no fear, no anger, only a calm, steady acknowledgement. He pulled back onto the road. The landscape rolled past, darkening as the light faded. He thought about the cub who'd become a lion, about the man who'd been younger then, less certain, trying to do right by a creature who didn't owe him anything. About the years that had passed and the distance that had grown in the moment, singular and unrepeatable, when all of that had collapsed into a single point of connection. Some bonds, he realized, didn't fade. They changed shape, went quiet, became invisible, but they didn't disappear. They waited, patient and enduring, for the rare moments when the world aligned just right and the distance between then and now became small enough to cross. The last of the light slipped below the horizon. The stars began to emerge, faint at first, then brighter, and David drove on through the gathering dark, carrying with him the memory of a lion who had remembered and the gratitude of a man who had been remembered in return.